Okay, so classification. What can you tell me about plants? Your notes there. These are sort of key things about plants. So we've said multicellular. Okay, there's two types of cell, eukaryotic or prokaryotic. Eukaryotic. That means that they have a nucleus. Remember, bacteria don't. All right? So they're eukaryotic cells, just like your cells. So at the moment, you're multicellular, plants are multicellular, your cells are eukaryotic, so are theirs. But the difference is that they have cell walls made of cellulose. Boys, you need to lift one of those handouts there. And we've said that they've got chlorophyll, so therefore, in chloroplasts, so therefore they can make their own food. So we describe them as being autotrophs. Have you heard of that word before? Yeah. Another thing that we use to classify them, because there are some eukaryotic cells there that have chloroplasts that can photosynthesize, but strictly speaking, they're not plants. And that's because they don't really show any kind of like differentiation. Now, by differentiation, we mean... no, we're not talking about that. We're talking about the fact, if you have a bunch of cells, if you have a pile of cells that all look the same, there's no differentiation. Whereas in your body, you've got neurons, you've got rod cells, cone cells, you've got red blood cells, white blood cells, differentiation, specialization. Okay, so they've got, if you think of a leaf, you've got xylem, you've got phloem, you've got upper epidermis, spongy, mesophyll, and so on. They've all got different structures, so there's a good degree of specialization there. Within the plant kingdom, we only need to look at two divisions. So in lower sixth, I'm not sure whether you remember anything about kingdom, phylum, class, order, genus and species. Do you remember anything about that? No. Okay, so every living organism on the earth can be divided into one of a number of kingdoms. So we've got plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, prokaryotes, which are like bacteria and so on. So there's 5 kingdoms. We're looking at the plant kingdom. Within that kingdom, then there are different subdivisions. So in the animal kingdom, we talk about there being different phyla. In plants, we talk about divisions. All right? Sure, look, you're 12 minutes late after the girls were back. About what?
What's called form, tutor, nonsense.
Right. So, if we were talking about the animal kingdom, it would be phylum, but we're talking about plant kingdom, so bryophyta and tracheophyta. So phyta means plant. And by bryophytes, we mean mosses, are examples of bryophytes. And we'll look at some photographs. Now, mosses, about that. So mosses, what do you need to know about mosses? They don't have true roots or leaves or stems. So they don't have the things we've talked about, we've learnt about before. So they do have green structures and they look like leaves, but they don't have the normal leaf structure with the upper epidermis, lower epidermis, stomata, and all those kind of things. They don't have roots. We said that they have rhizoids. Now, don't worry about that term there. Gametophyte isn't on your specification. Another thing they don't have is they don't have stomata. They don't have a cuticle. Now, if you think about leaves, why is there a cuticle? It's to keep the leaf waterproof, to stop it losing water by evaporation. What does stomata do? They open to allow transpiration to occur, but they close to prevent it from happening. But mosses only live in very damp areas, so water loss isn't going to be an issue. They live in very damp areas. They don't need to conserve water, so therefore they don't need a cuticle. They don't need stomata mainly. In terms of the other structures, they don't have any vascular tissue. Now, what do you think we mean about vascular tissue in plants? What's your vascular system? Not muscle, no. Yeah, so arteries, veins, capillaries is your vascular system. What do plants have to move water and sugars around? Xylem and phloem. So they don't have any vascular tissue. They don't have any xylem or phloem. In plants, xylem strengthens, gives support to the stem. So they don't have any of that. So they can't grow to be very big because they don't have that support mechanism. So they have to rely on cells being turgid. So we say support is by turgor. In other words, turgid cells giving support. And that's because there's no vascular tissue to strengthen the structures. So normally something like, let me see, a grass plant, okay, that can sort of grow upwards and stay upright, and it can be reasonably tall because there's xylem vessels there, and xylem has that woody lignin, which is really, really strong. How do they reproduce? Well, they make spores. And if we look at this diagram here, spores are made inside this capsule at the top. And then whenever conditions get dry, that dries and it splits open and it fires the spores out. Hopefully they land a little bit further away so they're not competing for moisture and light. And whenever conditions are right, then they'll germinate. Okay, so that's what you need to know about mosses. If we go back up here, the other division is the tracheophytes, and they have vascular tissue, so we'll write that they are called vascular plants. And there's two subdivisions that you need to know about. So pteridophyta are the ferns, and spermatophyta are the flowering plants. What makes plants different from animals? Chloroplasts. Right, got chloroplasts. What else? Cellulose cell walls, yeah. Okay, so if you think about the difference between us and plants, they've got cellulose cell walls, they've got chloroplasts, so they can photosynthesize. Are plants multicellular or unicellular? It's not a trick question. What are you? Multicellular. So what do you think of plants? Multicellular. So see on now if we look at some pictures, yeah, there's some mosses growing there on the footpath. Okay, so those are little blocks on the footpath. So we're talking about several millimeters in height. We're talking about small plants here. They're green. They photosynthesize. Need a pictures of mosses. Some of them are a little bit bigger. So quite often, okay, there's mosses on the side of a tree trunk. These are magnified. Okay, so we're talking about maybe a centimetre in height at the most. All right. You do burn. And if we look at the structure of it, you can see that there is a leafy sort of structure, but there's no proper roots. So these plants, where do you find mosses growing? On walls or trees. What's the place like where you find them? What are the conditions like? Damp. These plants do not have a big root system. And so they have to grow in places where there's a lot of surface water because they don't have roots to go deep down into the soil. So you only find them in damp places. They don't have roots. They've got these structures called rhizoids, which are like sort of like root hairs almost like. And this bit here is called the gametophyte now. In your notes I mention it, but okay, so there we've got a nice picture, the floor of a forest, and you see those leafy plants there? Those are ferns. Damp. So they're not Terribly well adapted for living in dry areas. They're only found in damp areas. There's more ferns. All right. So you've probably seen those plants growing before. Like there. But they're, again, what are the conditions? Better adapted than the mosses. They're an awful lot bigger. On the lower surface of the leaf, that's where their spores are made. And if you were to turn a leaf over at a certain time of the year, you'll see these sporophytes, and that's where their spores are. So they reproduce by making spores. There's more. And that's sort of a slice transverse section. And you can see these are the spores here. This is the surface of the leaf. And these are the spores inside the sporophyte, the sporangium underneath it. Okay, in terms of our notes then, what do we need to know? Well, okay, so they're much bigger. They show a bit more differentiation. They do have proper roots. So they have true roots, they have true stems, and they have true leaves. And they are pretty well adapted to living in terrestrial life. In other words, living in soil, living on the land. So they've got a waterproof cuticle, and they've got stomata which can close or open to control the water loss. They've also got good xylem and phloem. So xylem for water and phloem for sugars. Well, again, there is a bit of support from the turgid cells, in other words, turgor, but because they've got xylem vessels, that will give them a lot of support as well, because it's a woody substance. And again, they reproduce by making spores. And it is a case of learning these facts. Okay, you need to draw a line there and write spermatophyta. Okay, angiosperms is sort of the main group of spermatophytes. So flowering plants. So we're talking about roses, grass plants, all the plants you buy in the florist, but the things you see outside as well, where there are flowers. Things we're not talking about are the pine trees, the coniferous trees, evergreens. They produce by making cones, whereas angiosperms reproduce by making flowers. So these plants have obviously got true roots, true stem, true leaves. They've got xylem vessels, they've got phloem vessels, they've got everything else that we've talked about so far. They've got a waxy cuticle, a waterproof cuticle over the surface of the leaves and the stem. They've got stomata, and they can control their stomata to increase or decrease water loss by transpiration. And we've mentioned xylem and phloem. So we need to that's the missing words there. Support, again, yes, they rely on turgor, because if your mum and dad go on holidays and you forget to water the plants, they'll know, because your plants will have started to wilt. They probably won't have collapsed completely, because there's a lot of xylem vessels there, which contains lignin, which is a woody substance. So they show greater differentiation than ferns. They are better adapted to living on land, because if you think of trees and so on, they have a lot of xylem vessels that give a very woody tree trunk. They reproduce by making seeds. Seeds are resistant to drying out. If you think of an apple, you can eat an apple and you can actually swallow the seeds and the seeds come out your other end. If that was a dog eating, apples that was sort of nosing around, comes across apples lying underneath an apple tree, it eats the apple, it wanders off, maybe a day or so later it deposits the seeds in another area. Those seeds will start to germinate whenever the conditions are right. So the seeds are resistant to the acid in your stomach. They're resistant to drying out. You can keep seeds for years. So the seeds are really well adapted to terrestrial life. They don't dry out. And so we mentioned seeds there. So in terms of the comparison, mosses are the simplest. Then we've got ferns. Then we've got our flowering plants. So we're talking about progression. The last group are the best adapted to living on land. They can survive periods of drought. Seeds can survive drying out, whereas mosses can't. Mosses can only survive if there's a lot of water near the surface. And we're talking about vascular tissue, true roots to take up water, stem with xylem and phloem. So those mosses at the beginning didn't have any of those adaptations. So we've gradually got more complex. And so you need to be aware of that. The dominant plants on Earth, well, if you think of succession, we would have talked about succession to some extent, how you start off with bare rock and then you get soil and you start off with, mosses and then ferns and then small plants and then you end up with trees. Well, things like, sycamore, oak, chestnut trees, those are flowering plants. Those are the dominant species. So on the Earth, we've reached our climax community. We've got the flowering plants are the dominant species. All right? Okay, now we need to think about animals. So, in terms of animals, they are multicellular. They've got eukaryotic cells. What do we write in here? They feed on other organisms. What's the term for that? Well, what are plants? Autotrophs. What's the opposite to autotrophs? No, heterotroph. Hetero means other. Another thing about animals is they're capable of moving around. Plants can move their leaves, but a plant cannot locate its whole organism to another position. You can move your whole organism, and that term is locomotion.
Locomotion?
Yep.
That's a song.
Do you want to sing it?
No. Do it for fern, is it? What? Do it for the fern. Do it for the fern.
Okay, so locomotion means moving the whole... way back in first year, you learnt that all organisms can move. Plants can move. They can move their leaves, and they can move their stem, but animals can move the whole body. That's what locomotion is. They are diploid throughout most of their life cycle. Only their gametes are haploid. Now, this little bit here is not really important, so we're just going to skip down to here. So, the animal kingdom, you need to know these 4 phyla. Cnidarians, platyhelminths, annelids, and chordates. Do you know which phylum you're in?
We're in the synodity area.
We're in the division by what one? On the
Very right.
That's the one you're in, chordates. When we look at different phyla, we will compare things like how they feed. We will compare things like, how many layers of tissues they have. But another thing that we will comment on is their symmetry. So if you look at this, we've got some organisms there. What types of symmetry have you talked about in maths? Bilateral. Heterosexual is not symmetry. Somebody did. What type of symmetry does that have there? Starfish.
Asymmetry.
What type of symmetry does that have? Oh, guys, right, hold on. So, symmetry, radial symmetry. Radial symmetry, if you... Well, you're going to have to learn it quickly. Radial symmetry, everything's radiating from the middle. You know, if you draw a circle, the radius is the line from the middle. That's the radius there. So if we look at that diagram, you can chop that up into bits and they all look the same. In the same way that we've got radial symmetry there. All right. That starfish, if you look underneath it, the starfish's mouth is in the middle there. Shh. So there's some organisms that have radial symmetry. There's another organism that has radial symmetry. Okay, so again, its mouth is in the middle and you can draw lines out there and each bit is the same. Okay, so that's radial symmetry. Bilateral symmetry, if you take a shape and you draw a line, so you could draw a line down the middle. Draw a line down the middle, or you could draw a line across it. Basically, so there we go. You can draw a line down the middle of that organism. One side is the same as the other. Draw a line down the middle of that. We've got the same.
So that means there's only one?
Only one line of symmetry.
Is there any two types of symmetry?
In terms of what we're talking about, yes. Radial or bilateral. That's all we're talking about in animals. So bilateral means one line, two sides are the same. Radial, it's coming out from the middle, and we've got lots of you can draw lots of lines there. So we've mentioned that. What type of symmetry does the starfish have? Radial. What about this organism down here?
Bilateral.
Yeah, put a line down there, one side's the same as the other. What about the butterfly?
Bilateral.
Yeah, line down the middle. The dog?
Radial.
Bilateral. Ladybird?
Wait, how?
And that's a sea anemone. Radial.
Oh, the image.
Okay, another thing that we look at, body layers. Another thing we look at is this idea of cephalization, where we have sense organs, and you think of most of your sense organs, you've got your eyes, your nose, your mouth, your ears, all at the front of your body now. Okay, we're a little bit different from other mammals because we only walk on 2 feet. But if you think of a dog, that dog there, its sense organs are all at the front of the organism. The first bit to go into the new environment. So if it's going into a room, sticks its head in, it can see, it can hear, it can taste, it can smell. And that idea of getting all the sense organs in one area is called cephalization. And so mammals show a really high degree of cephalization. And insects, and birds and so on. But if you think of a starfish, it doesn't have a head. An earthworm, well, it does have it has some, it can taste, it can smell. If you shine a light, it can sense the light. Okay, so there are sense structures there, so that it has a lower degree of cephalization, whereas mammals have a much higher degree of cephalization. All right. Body layers. You started off life as a zygote, and that zygote divided to form a little ball of cells. Within a couple of days, you were a little ball of cells, but it was hollow. And that was called a blastula. Now, blastula will either consist of 2 layers of cells or 3 layers of cells. We start off life as 3 layers of cells. You are a triploblastic organism. You start off life as 3 layers of cells. Some simpler organisms only had 2 layers of cells. Okay, on that page there, underneath the diagrams of the symmetry, you've got diploblast, you've got triploblast. So a diploblast is an animal with how many layers? 2, and a triploblast is 3. Okay, if we look at the diagrams, we have got the bit in the middle is called the enteron. It's the cavity. So if you label that as the enteron or the gut cavity, so it's not a layer of cells, it is a space where the food will be. On my diagram, it's the green layer is the one that's next to that, and that's called the endoderm. Any guesses what the outer layer is called? Not bad. Ectoderm. So the one on the left, we've labelled the endoderm, we've labelled the ectoderm. This stuff here is non-living. It's not actually a layer, it's not a tissue layer, it's not a layer of cells. So it's non-living, it's called mesoglea. It's not a layer of tissue, there are no cells in it, it's just a gel-like substance. Whereas on the triploblastic organism, there is a third middle layer, and it's called mesoderm. Pardon? Yeah, oh aye. Mesoglea. Right. So tomorrow is Wednesday. I may or may not be here. I might have to go to the hockey to supervise a bus. So look, I'm setting, could you sit down and pay attention? So, Thursday, St. Patrick's Day, Friday, I don't have you. So this is work for Monday then. So if I'm here, I'll help you with it tomorrow. If I'm not, you get on with it yourself. And then you've got obviously homework for tomorrow night and Friday night as well. So you need to complete these notes. Now I will go through the summary on Monday, but that's all I'm going through on Monday. Look boys, sit down and wise up. Jamie, sit down at your seat. Make a note of this. Caleb, could you get something out to write on? Okay, so you need to go through the note sheet. So that's basically in your textbook. Okay, and then some questions out of your question book as well. Okay, so if I don't see you tomorrow, I'll see you on Monday.